I still own a motel and may have been renting rooms out to a family of vampires every 4 years for decades. Part 3, written by Strange Dangerous. Burn it all down. Those words rung clear in my head as if my mother were whispering them in my ear. Trust me, I wanted nothing more than to be done with this. The motel, the family, but there were some things I just couldn't let go. I started to worry that if I sold the motel, other secrets would be revealed. Dark secrets, damaging secrets. I could fill in that pit below their room, but what else was hiding on the motel grounds? I had no choice but to wait for the sale to either go through or fail. In the meantime, I packed up what I could from our old family home. Every photograph of my parents now felt different, less genuine. Why would they keep so much from me? I asked out loud to a room of family artifacts, meaningless mementos. Nobody answered me. 2 days passed and I waited for either the boy or the man in the truck to return. Instead, the first car to pull into my parking lot was that of the local sheriff. My body tensed and my mind went to the room and the blood-soaked carpet that I never replaced. I questioned whether or not I'd actually be honest if he asked me about it. Yes, of course I would be. I had nothing to hide. I knew nothing. Nothing except for the fact that I rented rooms to soulless immortal creatures that somehow acquired gallons upon gallons of blood without notice. I began to doubt my own composure. I waited at the open door to the office while he sat in his cruiser for 10 minutes or so. I wasn't sure if he saw me or not, but regardless, I held my ground. I noticed a little too late that my cleaning supplies abandoned in the lobby next to gallons of bleach. The cruiser door slammed shut and snapped my attention back to him. As he approached, he scanned the surroundings, taking note of the unlit vacancy sign. He turned back and registered the curtainless windows of each of the emptied rooms. That, of course, except for the families. "Afternoon," he said with the tip of his hat. "What can I do for you?" I asked as friendly as possible. He removed his shades and peeked over my shoulder into the lobby. "Wondering if I could have a moment of your time to ask some questions," he said with a smile. "Regarding?" "Well," he turned back to the mostly empty rooms. "Have you had any guests recently?" he asked. "Closed down a few weeks back, unfortunately," I said, trying to hide my anxiety. "That's not what I asked," he said, smiling again, but this time with menace. "Sorry," I apologized. "I don't mean to be rude or nothing, but we know Bill Henley was on his way up here a few days back. Just wondering if he made it." "Sorry, I don't know him," I said, hoping to end the conversation there. "You don't know the man who was fixing on buying your place?" he asked again, looking back at the family's room. "Oh, him. Yeah, him," he said, prying for more. My lawyer handled it all. I didn't meet him," I lied. "Not even when he stopped here for the night?" he asked, showing his cards. I swallowed hard. I wanted to tell the truth, but I wasn't ready for what came with it. "Oh, did he drive a truck?" I asked. "He did." "Then yeah, I saw it. Parked over there," I said, foolishly pointing towards the room. The sheriff turned to the room, to the parking spot, to my secrets. He took out a notepad and began writing something down. But he didn't stay with us. We were closed. So he kept in his car. "I think," I stuttered. "Think?" he asked, looking back at me. I didn't see him leave. But yeah, he was here for a bit. "If you know, the truck belonged to him at all," I said, fumbling with my words. "It did," he said, putting the notebook away. "Mind if I take a look around?" "Of course not," I said, with the words tumbling out of my mouth before my mind could stop them. I stepped aside to sort of lead him into the lobby, away from the family's room. Immediately, he took notice of the cleaning supplies and the bleach. "Is there a problem? Is he okay?" I asked, regretting my words immediately. The sheriff's gaze lingered on the bleach for a very long time. He then turned his attention back to me. I could see his mind working over something, thinking. Suddenly, it felt as if the air in the room shifted. His entire demeanor changed, and I felt an aura of warmth from him. He shrugged and cracked a smile. "Well, I figure it's going to be on the news soon anyway, if it ain't already." "What?" I asked. "Well, nothing good, that's for sure. That truck you saw, they found it about 200 or so miles west of here off the 80. All the way out there? What was he doing? I figured, feigning surprise. Well, we don't know. We don't know where he is, he said with his gaze drifting now to the knickknacks and photographs. Oh, that's not good. I don't like that, I said truthfully. You really ain't gonna like the next part. That buyer of yours has a lot to answer for. Like what? I asked, cutting him off. Well, the body found in the cab, burnt to a crisp, abandoned, he said, picking up a photograph of myself and my parents. I thought you said he was missing. You sure it wasn't him? I asked, trying to find something to do with my fidgeting hands. Too young, too small to be him. Best we can reckon it's a young man they found. No ID though. John Doe, he said, looking hard at the photo. These your parents? I nodded. He looked back at the photo, then back at me. Biological? He asked. I'm told I look more like my grandparents, really, I said. He smiled and returned the photo. I believe he looked for photos of my grandparents, but there were none. We stood there, trapped in a long, awkward silence. I motioned towards the kitchen door behind the front desk. Did you still want to look around? I asked, trying to lead him. Nah, maybe later. I just need to confirm he was here, really, he said, making his way back outside. I followed. Okay, well, thank you for stopping by, I said foolishly. He paused at the door, acknowledging my awkward statement. Then I saw it again, his mind working. He put his sunglasses back on. He was alone here, you said? He asked. I thought hard. What did I tell him? Did I slip? I couldn't remember. I don't know, I said. He looked at me as if he could tell I was lying. Could have been someone else in the truck. It was dark. I can't say for sure, I stammered out. He nodded in acceptance. Thank you for your time, he said. And with that, he was gone. But as he drove by the only remaining curtains still hanging in the motel rooms, he made a point to slow and look as he passed. I waited until he was out of sight and then ran back home as fast as I could. As soon as I reached the bathroom, I vomited. My nerves were a tangle of anxiety and guilt. I knew that the body they had found had belonged to the teenage boy, but what about the man? He was either still alive or still here. I searched the motel grounds for any sign of the man or other secret spots. I wandered past the property line into the clearing, and with the sunlight beating down on me, I had an epiphany. The teenage boy was on his way to another place like ours, a sanctuary. He would never have let himself get caught outside like that, not on purpose. In all my years of knowing the family, I had never seen them any time close to dawn or dusk. They were experts at avoiding the sun. Wherever he was going, he couldn't have been far from his destination. I knew what I had to do. I had to find their next stop. I had to know if it was anything like the motel. And if it was, how? Why? Could there be more of those earthen rooms cluttered with crystals and soft dirt covered in strangely written runes? I had to know. I packed what I could in my small car and locked up the motel. Before I left, I made sure to reload my grandfather's gun and place it in my bag, which I then placed on the passenger seat. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I was fairly certain that if I found anything, I had to be ready. The drive was long, but I drove slowly. I kept an eye out for any building or structures that could hide them. Luckily, the highway was an extension of the one that the motel sat on. It was another dead-end road, a long stretch of nothing, so spotting anything would be easy. As I passed the 200-mile marker, I slowed to a crawl and leaned over my steering wheel. An old barn crept into view around the 220 mark, and I knew it had to be there. It was the only building within miles. I pulled into the old dirt road alongside deep tire tracks that were left when the rain softened into mud. I stepped out of the car and pocketed the revolver. The sky overhead was gray and made for a dark afternoon. I followed the tracks as they led into the old rotten barn. The heavy doors were in disrepair, but the hinges swung as if they were new. Inside the barn was what you would expect from an antique structure. Old brittle hay and rusted equipment were left and forgotten. Everything looked as if it hadn't been touched in decades, everything except for a strange metal watering trough in the center of the barn. The sickening realization of what it was had set in before I saw the familiar dark rings around the inside. Like the bath in their room, this had been filled with blood. The ground surrounding the trough was stained from decades of crimson ichor seeping into it. As I stepped close, the ground bowed beneath my feet and the wood groaned. I stomped. The hollow echo of an empty chamber could be heard below. I kicked aside the dust and hay to reveal a trapdoor. There was less effort put into hiding this one, but then again, the location itself was the hiding spot. I found the finger holes and pulled up the door. The familiar scent of smoke, stale breath, and iron wafted up. I pulled the revolver from my pocket and climbed down. The room was smaller than the one below the motel, but it was very much the same. Odd words were again carved into the walls, but the wood replaced brick in this more ramshackle construction. The strange crystalline rocks were placed around the room in a pattern I hadn't noticed beneath the motel. There were fewer here, but enough to catch my eye. I pulled one out of the dirt and held it in my hand. Soft dusted salt seemed to rub off with the slightest touch. It was heavy in my hand more than you would expect. I held it in the light from my phone. There were dark red and blue mineral veins streaking through the otherwise milky white crystal. It was so dry it felt as if it sucked the moisture from my fingertips. I pocketed it and continued into the darkness. My foot sunk into an exceptionally soft patch of dirt. I realized I was standing on one of the earthen mounds, same as the 7 in the motel chamber. One, however, was unlike the rest. The dirt was discolored and more dry than the other mounds. There was also a fleck of white protruding just beneath the gray, unfertile soil. Hunched over, I made my way to the dying mound and uncovered the note written on a white piece of paper. A white piece of paper that just so happened to be stationary from our motel. It read, "Father, if you had found your way here, I am sorry. We waited for 3 days, but the fire burned so hot, Master said you could not return. I begged her to wait, but the soil grew damp and we had to move on. If you made it here, you know about the orphan. Our oldest home is in danger. In my slumber, I still feel your presence, so I hope you will find us soon. Hopefully so. We have left you a meal in the old farmhouse far from the road. I hope it gives you the strength to find us again. Matthew." I left the note where it laid. The farmhouse in question was far from the barn, but I worried that driving up might bring unwanted attention. I walked through waist-high grass on untilled soil of dead farmland. This plot of land had been long forgotten. The house itself was in better condition than the farm, but not by much. It had been lived in recently, but how recent I couldn't be sure. It was far from the highway and isolated in a way that only rural homes can be. I approached from the side of the home and peered through the dust-covered windows. The decor had a timeless, untethered look, and it was unclear if it had been abandoned for years or if the residents just had particular tastes. Regardless, I saw no signs of movement inside. I thought about entering through the window, but caught myself and did the rational thing. I knocked on the front door. I thought I heard a brief flurry of restrained movement somewhere inside the house. My hand went immediately to the revolver. My voice was knotted and stuck in my throat. I swallowed hard and tried to call out, but my nerves wouldn't allow it. Instead, I reached out for the doorknob, and the moment my fingers made contact, the door drifted open. It felt as if I were being invited inside. I thought I heard a brief flurry of restrained movement somewhere inside the house. My hand went immediately to the revolver. My voice was knotted and stuck in my throat. I swallowed hard and tried to call out, but my nerves wouldn't allow it. Instead, I reached out for the doorknob, and the moment my fingers made contact, the door drifted open. It felt as if I were being invited inside. My shoes slipped slightly on an old pile of mail that had been stacked up from years of neglect. Some were postmarked as far back as the late 90s. My first instinct about the decor was correct. Thick layers of dust seemed to coat most things in the home, but certain spots had been wiped clean with use. A path in the hallway rug was worn down from recent footsteps. I followed them back to the kitchen. There were dishes in the sink and a box of discontinued cereal on the counter next to an empty jug of milk. The power had long ago been shut off, and the contents of the fridge had rotted past the state of decay and no longer even smelled. The ashtray on the kitchen table, however, was packed full of fresh butts. A single unsmoked cigarette was left next to a matchbook. One thing became obvious. The meal was not left in the kitchen. "Hello?" I called out, adjusting my grip on the revolver. A metallic rattle and pin moan came from somewhere in another room. I stepped carefully in the direction of the ghostly noise. I could hear a subtle rhythmic tapping coming from behind the door of a room at the end of the hallway. The distance to that door felt longer than the distance from the house to the barn. The long drawn-out moan seemed to seep out from beneath the cracks in the door. I removed the gun from my jacket pocket, and with my other hand I carefully opened the door. The ghoulish noise ceased in the moments that I opened the door, replaced by the squeak of unused hinges. I stepped back and aimed. But it was just a bathroom. The soft blue and Pepto-pink tiles were not the horror I expected on the other side of the door. The pipes beneath the sink let out a ghostly moan as they groaned from unuse, and a steady drip of a leaky faucet patterned behind the shower curtain. I understand now that it was not a bright idea, but I had driven 4 hours and had no other options, none that would provide the comfort of a seat. So I placed the gun on the sink and sat down. I only had a moment of relief before I saw the silhouette behind the semi-opaque shower curtain. I pushed on the curtain thinking it was just a trick of the light, but my hand made contact with something solid. Before I could stand, the silhouette formed into a figure of a person as it reached out towards me. I stood quickly, but a withered white hand covered in blood emerged from the shower. I tripped and gasped for anything to catch myself. I grabbed a hold of the only thing standing between myself and the figure, the shower curtain. As I fell back, the curtain tore from the rings and fell onto me. Frantically, I crawled backwards out from under the curtain and out of the room, away from my gun. I pulled my pants up and struggled to my feet, realizing that the thing standing in front of me was not pursuing me. Instead, the emaciated figure of a dead man hung suspended above the bathtub, swaying slightly from my push. The room began to spin as the horror of what was in front of me became clearer, with the sound of every wet drop of blood dripping into the bath. He was the meal. I grabbed my gun, and before I knew it, I was already outside. I considered my options. I thought about burning it down, but that would only bring attention. I knew nothing about fingerprints and fire and evidence. The safest option was to do nothing. This house had remained hidden for so long, why wouldn't it stay that way? Just to be safe, though, I took the shower curtain and wiped down any surface I remembered touching. I locked the door from the inside and closed it. The walk back to the barn was long and arduous. I replayed the images in my mind over and over, and I thought back to the bathtub I had cleaned so many times before. If there were any doubt in my mind before, it had been erased. The family that I had known my whole life were no longer human. They truly were creatures of the night that preyed on the weak and drank their blood. It should have been obvious, and maybe it was. Maybe my parents knew all along. They had to. But me? It had only coalesced in my mind after seeing the body. It became clear that day. Every 4 years, for a week at a time, I had been in the presence of unearthly evil. They were inhuman, unnatural, otherworldly. They were vampires. We were just one stop on their tour of death. They must have other places like ours, just close enough to make it in a night's drive. My aunt lived only a few hours east of us. My memories of visiting her came flooding back. It now made sense that every time I stepped into the guest house behind her home, the cellar door would smell of smoke, stale breath, iron, and every once in a while, soft lavender too. It seems now that my aunt did what my parents couldn't. That's probably why they left her that last letter. They knew that she would be capable of doing what they never could. They had made the deal and tolerated the slaughter under their roof, but part of me understood why. Even if they wanted to burn it all down, She was still their little girl, and she needed a safe place. As I stood in front of the burn pit out back behind the motel, I watched the plastic shower curtain melt into the flames. A flicker of light off glasses caught my eye just outside the center of the fire. I used a stick to dig it out. Glasses, thick-rimmed glasses. He was never coming back, Bill Henley. The man who was just going to purchase my motel was not coming back. Like it or not, this motel was mine, and as far as I knew, I still had 4 years to figure out what to do with it. Part 4. Over the next few days, I was little more than a ghost haunting the hotel grounds. I drifted from room to room trying to cobble together a purpose. I had quickly realized that I was bound to this property, and whether it was an ancient family curse or legal contract, I was supposed to stay here and maintain the property. I felt obligated to protect my sister, even if she barely resembled the little girl I remember. My mother, for all her faults, had done what she could do to protect her daughter. Working over the events in my mind and recounting the visits of the family, I had come to the conclusion that my parents had made a deal to save my sister. I remember her illness. I remember her withering away before my eyes. She was going to die, in fact, but somehow she didn't. She continued living as an eternal child, cursed to walk an ever-evolving earth as herself, frozen in prepubescence. They had changed her, and I was determined to figure out how. I looked for clues in my father's old lockbox, but found little more than unfamiliar photos and documents that no longer had any relevance. One thing that stood out, though, was an early memento that my grandfather had kept. It was the first brochure for the cave system. If not for the scribbled red circle on the map, it may have been worth something. I spent an entire day sifting through the dirt in the space below their room. The soft earth that filled their mounds was starting to change. With the exception of what I assumed was the teenage boys, the dark earthen mounds were starting to dry and crumble. The boys' spot was still dark with a fresh dampness about it, though it grew more dry and brittle with every passing day. The salty crystalline rocks placed near each of the mounds seemed to draw out whatever moisture was in the dirt, drying it into a dead, useless dust. The crystals themselves were not unique nor rare by any means. They were the ones that lined the ceiling and the floors in the deepest chambers of the caverns. I remember them from my childhood visits. I felt a strange longing to return there. I needed to uncover its secrets. While they had been closed for almost a year now, there was still a park ranger named Graham who remained on the premises. He would sometimes stop by for free lobby coffee, always overpaying. He joked that we were the only coffee shop in town, which was partially true. I hadn't seen him in a few months, but his truck would pass regularly as he would survey the outlying grounds. I could tell he was bored, and I thought I could manipulate that into an eagerness to help me. I called ahead, but the line went straight through to an automated recording, an apology to potential visitors about the indefinite closure. With little else to do, I made some coffee and filled a thermos for him. I drove down to the closed lot and parked just outside the locked fence. I could see his truck parked inside, so I knew he was there. He saw me arrive on the security camera, so he was already greeting me with a wave as I crossed the closed parking lot. "Afternoon, Graham," I shouted on approach. "What brings you down here?" "Research," I said, asking myself the same question. "When was the last time you made it here?" "Years. My folks were still around." "Ah, well, there's a lot to see. The remodel finished right before the shutdown. I've been dying to show somebody around, so I'm glad you're here," he said, opening the door. I gave him the coffee and his eyes went wide. He stopped coming by after I closed up shop, so I could tell he was grateful to have one last cup. We walked into the dimly lit lobby, potent with the smell of new carpet and fresh paint. "Wait here while I go turn everything on," he said, clearly excited. I stood in the darkness for almost a minute before the lights came on with a quiet hum of electric life. The lobby was filled with media displays of the cavern's history. There were photos and stories of opening day with updates for each anniversary. As I waited for Graham to return, I studied the older photos behind the glass case nearest to me. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight. I swore I could feel someone watching me. It was only then that I noticed his gaze staring back from one particularly old photograph. In it, a familiar figure stood at the center of a group of visitors looking back at me. It was the old man from the family. It was as if he were somehow staring at me through the photo. His eyes locked on the lens of the camera, and in turn on me. It was hard to discern his age in that old faded photo, but he looked very much the same as he did today. The only difference was that he, instead of his usual gray suit, he was wearing a park ranger uniform. "Ah, you've met Jerry," said Graham with a laugh. "Jerry?" I asked. "I mean, we don't actually know his name, but we call him Jerry. He was one of the first rangers to work the park. Him and his colleagues were responsible for a lot of early mapping of the cave system. This photo and a bunch of other stuff was found locked in an old utility closet. Didn't even know it existed because that particular cave was closed off. Check it out," he said, leading me over to an illustrated map covering the entire wall. He pointed to a blank spot of the map. Found it right there, actually. I had brought my grandfather's old brochure, so I pulled it out to compare it to the current map. The blank tunnel he was pointing to still existed on my grandfather's map. Yeah, they left out a few of the trickier spots in the new map. They didn't want to entice explorers into places they might not get out of, he said. "May not get out of?" I asked. "Yeah, steep inclines, drop-offs, or just plain tight squeezes. They left those spots off, and the map you see today is just the safest, what we call vanilla trails." I showed him the red circle at the end of the pathway that they decided to omit in the modern map. "Any idea why this is circled?" I asked. "Looks like the gulch, or at least whatever is past it." "What is past it? What is the gulch?" I asked. "Not much to tell. It's one of the steepest descents and almost impassable without gear or a ladder. Which is a shame, really. I hear it's one of the most beautiful places in the system. It's got very unique veined stalagmites." "Like this?" I said, pulling the crystalline rock from my pocket. "You're showing me a federal offense, I hope you know that," he said with a chuckle. "What?" I asked, not expecting that response. "You are literally showing me plundered goods. Where'd you even get that?" "My grandfather's collection," I confessed. They were a little more willy-nilly with the rules back then. Everybody was taking tokens and souvenirs. Before the Tucker boy, they kind of let people roam, he said, pointing at a photo of a well-dressed folks climbing a dangerous rock formation. "What happened to the Tucker boy?" I asked. "No clue. That was the problem. They looked for him for weeks. He was visiting with his wife and son and went missing. Well, right around the gulch, actually. Which is why it's not on the maps," he said with an educational chuckle. "I thought you said he was a boy." 18, but he was married with a son. Times were different back then." Graham walked over to another glass case away from the main display. "They've talked about taking this down for renovation. I mean, it's a little dark," he said, pointing at the display of old missing persons photos spanning decades of the park's operations. "I had no idea," I gasped. "That's him right there, Mr. Tucker himself," he said, pointing at a class photo of a face I knew all too well. The teenage boy from the family stared back, younger and happier. I was transfixed, but Graham was already moving on. "Listen, I got nothing on the docket today, so if you want, I can take you close to the gulch." "I gotta get some lights," he said, already on his way to the back room. As I awaited for his return, I made my way to the elevators that would bring us down to the caverns. The gift shop was located just across from them, so it would be the first thing visitors would see when they resurfaced. Cheesy t-shirts, postcards, and other junk were crammed into a small space. The entire shop seemed to be designed to frame a bookshelf filled entirely with copies of a history book about the caverns. Curious, I opened the book and flipped through the first few pages. It was as if the old man were haunting me through time itself. Again, his blank stare caught my eyes immediately, looking out from full-page photograph of a staff photo inside the largest chamber of the caverns. It was labeled October 23rd, 1924, 1 year after opening day. Even his friendly park ranger uniform, his presence was so chilling that I almost missed her. Holding the hand of the old man was a teenage girl. She looked very much the same, but thinner and more gaunt. My attention was suddenly stolen by the clutter and clank of Graham approaching with his gear. "Did he have a daughter?" I asked, pointing at the photo of the old man. Graham leaned over to give a half-involved glance. "Like I said, we don't even know his real name," he said with a half shrug. Then he walked over and hit the button to the elevator. His excitement was doing nothing to soften my growing anxiety over the photographs. The ride down took longer than I remembered, and my ears popped from the pressure change as we descended deep underground. As soon as the elevator doors opened into the first chamber, Graham disappeared into the darkness. "Wait here," he said, stepping out. I followed but stopped right outside the elevator. The dim emergency lights cast haunting shadows across the cavern walls. It was just enough light for Graham to navigate without his flashlight. I could hear nothing but his footsteps and the muffled silence of the stale cavern air. When he reached his destination, his footsteps ceased and the silence settled in. To my right, I heard a faint, distant flutter and what I thought was a faint screech. A loud mechanical click signaled the lights turning on and filling even the deepest corners of the cavern with comforting light. Graham returned, and with a wave he ushered me to follow him. "All right, let's start this private tour," he said, heading right in the direction of the eerie sounds I had just heard. "There's no creaky plumbing down here, is there?" I asked, remembering the sink in the old house. "Nope, all creaky sounds are natural cave occurrences," he joked. I hoped. I followed him anyway. The walk through the main chambers and less traveled paths was filled mostly with small talk. Graham lamented on the fact that reopening wasn't guaranteed, despite the money spent on the remodel. He truly loved the caverns and couldn't see himself doing anything else. "People would die for this gig. It's creme de la creme of Park Service posts. I realize how lucky I am to have it," he said with a tinge of real sadness. It became obvious that we were reaching the end of the modern map because the lights started to stagger more with longer distances between each light. The fixtures themselves were older than the rest, and some were entirely out, creating breaks of darkness in the already dim cavern. Each time we reached an old iron gate, he would search a massive key ring for one out of a dozen keys that would open it. Eventually, the light no longer lit our way, and he switched on the lamps and handed me a helmet. "I probably should have given this to you earlier, but these low ceilings make it necessary now," he said with a smile. I followed behind in a half crouch as he pointed out interesting geological sites that had been hidden from the public for decades. I noticed that on some of the cave walls were starting to display the same dark red and blue mineral veins as the crystals I had collected from their chamber. "What's that?" I asked, pointing to a ruined carving I recognized from the room below the motel. "No idea what it says. Old-timey graffiti, I guess," he assured me. As the ceiling and walls seemed to close in around us with each step, the warm air seemed thicker as well. I felt as though it was getting difficult to breathe and my back was starting to ache from the unnatural posture. Graham must have sensed my discomfort. "It opens up a little further ahead. We're almost there," he said, trying to comfort me. He was right. As soon as we reached the next chamber, the air seemed to grow colder as well. The floor had until now been paved with a gripping cement that had given away to the cavern's natural floor, a slippery surface that felt very much like sandstone. "I present the Gulch," he said while grabbing hold of my jacket to prevent me from passing him. He switched on a very bright lantern and it lit up the enormous room. My breath left my lungs as I noticed why he had grabbed hold of me. The steep drop-off was only a few feet ahead, and it was more of a cliff than an incline. It dropped down maybe 20 or 30 feet into a lower tunnel that led further into the darkness. "How do we get down?" I asked, leaning forward to get a better look. "We don't. Tour stops here. If we so much as sprain an ankle, we're pretty much done for. No cell service, nobody knows we're here, and nobody will come looking for weeks. That's a level of irresponsibility that will cost me my job," he said, finally serious. But his adherence to the rules went out the door when we heard a haunting sound. A faint cry echoed from the darkness past the gulch. "Do bats make it this far down?" I asked, my voice shaky and afraid. I watched his mind wrestle with the possibilities as he shook his head slowly. "Then what was that?" I asked. He turned to me, his eyes wide and afraid. He shook his head again. As my own voice echoed down the cavernous path ahead, the sound ceased as if hearing me. In those brief moments of silence when we still shared doubt that we had heard anything at all, I could feel him pull my jacket to lead me back out. But then we heard it. "You've returned?" asked a voice from the distant darkness. It sounded like an echo without a voice to reflect. I could feel Grim's body tense and stiffen with the acceptance that what we heard was very real and not from our own imaginations. "What have you brought me?" it called out, vulnerable and afraid. "Nobody should be down there." "How did you get down there?" Graham asked as if he wanted an answer from himself and not the ghostly voice below. There was a moment where neither spoke. It was as if both were working out what to say next. "Who's up there? Please help," it said, the voice now small and almost childlike, more vulnerable than before. "I'm a park ranger. I can help you," he said. I realized that it was now me holding onto his jacket, trying to hold him back. "Stay where you are," he called out to the childlike voice in the darkness. He turned to me and with a look of defeat or unwanted heroism, "We have to help," he choked out. "Do we?" I asked as he moved past me to an old metal utility trunk just to the right of the room. As he struggled to find the key to open the trunk, I peered into the darkness looking for any sign of movement. For a moment, I thought I saw a small pale form move just beyond the edge of the shadow, but my attention was soon taken by the metal groan of the trunk opening. Graham pulled out a rope ladder that attached to the side of the already secured trunk and dropped it below. The ladder unraveled along the steep incline all the way to the floor. "I've been trapped. Please come down and help me," the childlike voice said, slowly losing all emotion, the urgency replaced with a calm sense of command. I followed after Graham as he descended down the ladder. As my hands gazed the coarse, granular texture of the cavern wall, it felt as if the moisture was drawn from my skin. With each labored step down, the cold, dry air stung my lungs. By the time I reached the bottom, Graham was already halfway across the gulch with the lantern held high. Somehow, the light seemed to still stop at the edge of the shadowy darkness ahead. "How did you get down here?" he asked, walking slowly towards the darkness ahead. "I've always been down here," said the voice, its childlike essence given away to a frightening growl. At the edge of the darkness, Graham stopped to adjust the lamp, doing everything he could to cast more light towards the unseen voice. With his attention on the lamp, Graham didn't even see it coming. It had no time to react. A pale white figure emerged from the darkness and skittered across the cavern floor, grabbed Graham by the ankles and pulled him into the ground. The lantern shattered on impact. I stood there frozen at the bottom of the ladder, my own light only casting a few feet in front of me. "Graham?" I called out. "Run," he responded in a granular, grasping moan. So I climbed. I climbed faster than I thought possible, skipping rungs with each aching pull as my muscle worked on instinct and adrenaline. I could hear the cold, wet patter of naked flesh hitting the cavern floor as the figure raced towards me. When I reached the top of the ladder, I glanced back to see a figure pulling itself across the floor with unnatural speed. As I turned to pull the ladder up, my light cast just far enough to reach the bottom of the gulch. A withered, claw-like hand covered in bright red blood reached out to grab the bottom rung. It pulled with inhuman strength. I braced myself and pulled back. I could hear its other hand clawing at the sandpaper-like surface of the cavern wall, struggling to gain footing. I looked to my right, and in the open utility trunk, sitting atop a coil of rope and other gear, was a silver-coated pickaxe. As I felt myself teetering on the edge of falling, I let go of the rope. I grabbed the pickaxe, and in one fluid motion I swung hard, severing one side of the rope ladder. But still, it climbed, the shriveled torso of a ghost-white child covered in Graham's blood. It looked up from below with soulless black eyes. There was no fear, only hunger. From its waist hung long strips of withered flesh and mangled bone, what I assumed were once its legs. The creature made it halfway up the ladder before I swung again, fraying the remaining side of the rope. The creature did not slow, undeterred by my pickaxe. My mind raced as I considered my next swing, the rope or the creature. I wasn't sure if the next blow would cut the rope, but I was even less sure it could kill whatever it was that was climbing. I swung. The rope snapped and the ladder fell below. The creature slid back down the incline, hitting the bottom with a sickening wet thud. I waited with bated breath as I listened for movement. I called out hopelessly into the darkness. "Graham?" "He is no more," said the voice directly below. I swallowed hard and held my lantern over the edge. As shadows crept back, they revealed the creature below. I expected a crumpled, broken mess from the fall, but instead, there it is, staring up at me, unfazed. Though its resemblance to a human was slight, I could see the aspects of the family in its emotionless stare and pale, waxy skin beneath the red blood. The naked figure was child-size, but its limbs and features were distorted, odd and long. Its bulbous, veiny head held two bulging black eyes with thin lips and barely restrained, sharp, jagged teeth. It looked as though it may have been human at one time, but its form now was nothing more than a legless, emaciated ghoul with dry, withered skin. Its few remaining strands of hair were matted down with wet blood. "Will you help me out?" it asked. "Why are you down there?" I cried. "They took my legs and left me to rot," it said, with its shark-like eyes locked on mine. "Who?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I gave her the gift, but she turned on me. I can give you the gift too, if you help me up," it sneered. "How?" I asked. "I will drink from you, and you will drink from me, and when you slumber beneath the salted earth, it will leach the very essence of death from your being. We can live here together, forever, but each night you will follow me here, and we will die beneath the crystalline earth, only to wake at night, revived by the salted soils," it said, digging its claws into a patch of loose, gravelly sand. "What is stopping you from killing me once I help you?" I asked. "Solitude. Eternity is meaningless if you're alone." "What about Graham?" I asked, pointing into the darkness. "Can you bring him back?" "He was not worthy of the gift. You must choose it. He is nothing more than a meal, sustenance after a famine. But you, I can smell the gift on you. You know of my children. You know what it means." "If they are your children, why are you here?" I asked. "She accepted the gift, and we lived here for years, preying on the weak that wandered into our realm. And then he arrived and stole her attention from me. When she gave him the gift, he convinced her to leave our home. When I refused to let her go, he took my legs and left me down here to starve. But as I said, death does not come easy down here. Not for us." "If I help you, will you make me like you?" I asked, my voice shaky and unsure. "Yes," it smiled. I looked down at the silver axe in my hand. I thought back to the silver-tipped bullets in my grandfather's box. He must have known. This pickaxe was here for a reason, coated in shimmering silver. I knew what I had to do. I tied off the coiled rope in the box and dropped it down. The creature quickly grabbed hold and pulled itself up, one clawed hand over the other. It climbed as its mangled lower half dangled below. I stepped back and readied myself. As the creature crested the incline and pulled itself onto my level, I raised the pickaxe high over my head. Quickly, I brought it down on the creature's skull with a sickening crunch. I let it go and the blood-covered ghoul fell forward onto the ground in front of me. Slowly, it turned its head, and the black, expressionless eyes locked on mine. "Silly, silver slows us but cannot kill us," it smiled, baring its rows of sharp teeth. As it wrapped its sickeningly long fingers around the handle of the axe, I reached into my pocket. It pulled at the handle, trying to free the pickaxe from its head. Too focused on what was in my hand, I lurched forward with the only weapon I had left, the sharp, crystalline rock. But the creature was fast and swiped at my feet with incredible quickness, just as it did with Graham. I fell backwards hard and hit my head on the rocks, but the helmet saved me from an almost certain concussion or worse. I was still woozy when the creature climbed on top of me, the pickaxe still embedded in its skull. With one arm I fought it back, holding it by the neck. With the other, I gripped the crystalline rock. With his face only inches from mine, I closed my eyes and plunged it into the creature's chest. Almost immediately, the skin around the puncture withered and cracked as the rock leached the life from the creature. I pushed it off me and crawled backwards. The creature's blank stare gave way to true horror as it looked down at the fatal piercing blow. Confused, its hands weakly clawed at the embedded stone. I stood up and removed the axe from its skull. Again, I raised it high and then brought it down hard. This time, the skull collapsed beneath the blow. Its flesh crumbled in decay until nothing but dust and blood sat before me, soaking into a sludgy mess. Confident that I had ended this ancient evil, I pushed the curdled blood and mudded flesh into the gulch below. I then used the rope to climb back down into the gulch, unwilling to take the creature's word that Graham was gone. As I stepped into the darkness, the ground squished beneath me. I directed the light to my feet and massive amounts of blood that surrounded them. I found Graham only a few feet into the darkness. His body was cold, but I could have sworn I still felt a pulse. Blood oozed from the large gashes in his throat, stomach, and arms. Still, I had to try. He was heavy, but I managed to drag him all the way back to the rope. It was only then that I had the realization that there was no way I could get him out, not on my own. By the time I could find help, he would surely be dead, and if he were dead, I would have to explain why. The creature that inflicted his wounds was nothing more than blood-soaked dust, which made for a poor explanation. They would ask me how I found him, what happened, and how he could have lost so much blood without a jagged rock in sight. I stood there watching his blood slowly ooze out into the grainy sand beneath, mixing with the discolored sludge of the creature that had killed him. I had made peace with my only viable option. I would have to leave him here and hope that by the time they found him, it would look like he fell climbing. I didn't want my friend to stay here forever, but just long enough not to incriminate me with defensive wounds. I knew that he would understand. We both witnessed an unnatural evil, and there was no way anybody else would believe it, not without evidence. I pulled my crystalline stone from the body muck and stuffed it into my pocket. After I said my goodbyes to Graham, it took me hours to find my way back out of the caverns. Back in the gift shop, I cleaned myself up and did the best to remove any evidence that I had visited. I even returned the helmet to the rack after wiping away any trace of blood. I was tired and weak by the time I stumbled outside into the night. I drove home in a daze and barely remember crawling into bed. The days that followed were heavy with guilt and sorrow. Graham lost his life because of my foolish actions, and even though it meant the evil down there was finally gone, I couldn't help but wish it was me instead of Graham. That was still down there, rotting, waiting to be found. On the third day after the events in the cavern, I was awoken mid-afternoon by a knocking at the office door. I expected to open it to a weary traveler, but instead I found myself face to face with the sheriff. He lowered his sunglasses and cut right to the point. "Mind if I come inside? I got questions about I have a feeling you might know something." "Sure," I said, breathless, already worried. I led him inside the office and he made his way over to check-in desk. He pulled out a tablet from under his jacket and set it down. "You were with him on Thursday, correct?" he asked, as if I had already admitted to it. With him?" I stumbled. The sheriff turned on the tablet and he was navigating it. He said, "We have CCTV footage showing you at the Caverns Visitor Center." Before I could even answer, the video was already playing. I watched myself walking across the parking lot and waving to a smiling, still living Graham. "Yes, I brought him coffee. He used to come in often, but it had been a while, so I stopped by. Is he okay?" I asked, regretting my last question. The sheriff cocked his head to one side. "Questioning me?" "Just coffee," he asked. My brain seemed to shut down, overloaded with the possibilities of what he knew, why he was there, and why he hadn't arrested me yet. "Well, he showed me around the renovations," I offered. He nodded, accepting my answer. "Gotcha," he said, already navigating to another video. "Is there a problem?" Did he get in trouble? I asked, feigning ignorance. Well, there is a problem. Not that you did anything wrong, he said, in an almost apologetic manner. He could sense my discomfort and cleared his throat. Before he hit play on the video, he explained. Did he mention anything strange when you met? Did he seem afraid of anybody? Anything? No, I lied. So after you left, he missed his rounds. We believe he slept in the center that evening, which isn't illegal. He has late nights and early days, I get it. But when he did emerge later that night, well, he said, hitting play. I watched the grainy video fast forward until the door to the center opened. The sheriff then showed the video, and I watched as Graham staggered out of the visitor center, still alive. I bit my tongue to hide my surprise. Notice that he is possibly impaired. He is pointing to Graham as he stumbled across the parking lot. We think he may have hit his head while, well, I don't know, he added. Is he okay? I asked with genuine hope. Without answering my question, he asked another. Do you recognize this car? I watched as a familiar old station wagon pulled up into the parking lot. I was too shocked to answer. The family had returned, almost 4 years too early. I watched as they pounced on Graham, but they did not hurt him. Instead, they dragged him to the bed of his own truck and tied him down at the ankles and wrists. His arms and legs were splayed out in the corner of the bed, 2 men holding each arm, while the middle-aged woman and the older woman held his legs. The teenage girl just stood there, watching him. And even though the footage was grainy, I swear I could see somebody else watching from the car window. My sister. Hold on, you don't need to see this, he stumbled, trying to end the video, but instead fast-forwarding it. I watched as the family got back in their car and left, leaving Graham exposed in his truck. I watched as the sun crept across the parking lot as it rose above the trees. I watched as his body ignited the moment the sunrise reached his foot. I watched it burn him slowly from his feet all the way to his head until there was nothing more than a charred corpse. I watched my friend die a second time. I'm so sorry. You should have not seen that, he stuttered, finally just powering down the tablet. There was a moment of silence as he let me process the horrific murder I had just witnessed. Well, we believe they doused him in an unknown accelerant. We're not sure how, but they burned him alive, just like the young man we found in Henley's truck. We just want to know why. Do you recognize them? He asked. I shook my head in disbelief. We don't know who they are, but we feel like they may be responsible for both deaths. He trailed off. I felt my head spin and asked to sit down, realizing that I had just witnessed my friend's death. The sheriff eased up on the questions and tried to soften the situation. He offered me his card and told me to call him if I remember anything. He left me there on the couch in the lobby, reeling from the realization that I no longer had 4 years to figure it out. They were already here, and that means they would be checking in sooner or later. I couldn't help but feel that somehow they knew what I had done. I needed to come up with a plan to keep myself safe and somehow free my sister from their grasp. But instead, all I could do was replay the last word the sheriff said before I completely shut down. He pointed again to the frozen frame of the old man, the old woman, the middle-aged couple, and the teenage girl, and asked, "Have you ever rented a room to this family?" I lied and told him, no. Thank you to Strange Dangerous for allowing me to narrate this story. I hope you all enjoyed part 3 and 4 of this. If anybody has been wondering where I've been the last couple weeks, I've been down at the Dixie and McFarland fires doing firefighter work. But thank you all for sticking in there, and thank you all for subbing to my channel. Remember, when staring into the abyss is also staring into you. Until next time, good night.